There is a place on Mount Rose Highway, somewhere between the noise of Reno and the blue calm of Lake Tahoe, where the road climbs so high the air thins and the trees grow shorter. On a Saturday morning in July of 1982, two hikers were moving through that meadow when they noticed something that didn't belong. At first glance, it looked like a woman crouching near a fallen log, maybe resting, maybe watching a bird. They moved closer. She wasn't resting. She wasn't watching anything. She was dead. The back of her head told the story that her face, still calm, still young, could not. A single gunshot. She had been bent forward when it happened, maybe tying her shoes, and the person standing behind her had taken that moment as the one that ended everything. She was wearing a powder blue sleeveless shirt, Lee Ryder's jeans, and yellow tennis shoes. Tucked into her pocket was a folded bikini piece. Beneath her clothes, a blue swimsuit. She had woken up that morning planning to go to the water. She had not planned for anything else. Investigators arrived and spread out across the meadow. In the dirt, they found footprints, 2 sets going in, 1 set going out. Whoever had walked in with her had walked out alone, calmly leaving no signs of chaos or panic, no discarded objects, no story written in the earth beyond that brutal arithmetic. 2 minus 1 equals gone. She had not struggled. There were no defensive wounds on her arms, no broken fingernails, no bruises that suggested she had seen it coming. She had trusted whoever stood behind her. The medical examiner put her age somewhere between 25 and 35, height 5 feet 5 inches. About 112 pounds, brown hair pinned in a bun, hazel eyes. The details piled up quickly. A cesarean section scar across her abdomen, 11 centimeters long, old scars on her left knee, her right shin, her right foot, a blackened toenail on the left foot from some long-ago injury, a vaccination scar on her left arm, and teeth that no dentist would ever forget, a gold bridge with porcelain facing spanning 3 upper teeth, crooked front teeth, a lower jaw shifted out of alignment. The kind of dental work someone remembers because it is uncommon and expensive and specific. There was no identification, no wallet, no keys, no jewelry, no papers of any kind. Someone had made sure of that. The men's underwear placed over the wound at the back of her head had been placed there after the shot, not before. Someone had looked at what they had done and covered it. That detail says something about the person who left the meadow with 1 set of footprints. It says they were methodical. It says they had done this before or something very much like it. Before we go any further, we'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. Drop it in the comments below, and if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed. We don't stop until every name gets found. No one called about her. Not that day, not that week, not that year. No parent filed a missing persons report. No employer noticed an empty desk. No roommate noticed a bed not slept in. No friend waited by a phone that never rang. She had simply stepped out of the world, and the world did not register the absence. She was buried at our Mother of Sorrows Catholic Cemetery in Reno. Her grave had no headstone. The only thing marking it was a small plastic green flag, the kind utility crews push into soil to mark buried water lines. She was given a name that was never hers. They called her Sheep's Flat Jane Doe. The Washoe County Sheriff's Office opened an investigation and did everything a serious homicide unit does. They canvassed every hotel and lodging property in the Lake Tahoe corridor. They asked every housekeeper, every front desk worker, every bartender. Nobody recognized her. Nobody had a guest who had checked in and not checked out. They distributed facial sketches to more than 300 law enforcement agencies across the western United States. They ran her fingerprints through the national database. Nothing. They contacted dentists across multiple states, hoping someone would recognize that unusual dental work. Nobody came forward. The vaccination scar on her arm and the sophistication of her dental restoration, specifically the gold bridge with porcelain, led investigators to form a theory that held for nearly 3 decades. They believed she was European, not American. A visitor, possibly an immigrant, possibly someone who had traveled from overseas and left no trail because her life was rooted somewhere across an ocean. Interpol was contacted. Queries went out internationally. The answer that came back was the same answer that came back from everywhere. No matches, nothing. DNA had been collected from the crime scene, including from a rape kit preserved from the day the body was discovered. But in 1982, forensic DNA science did not yet exist in any practical form. The samples went into storage, where they would sit for the next decade, waiting for the world to catch up. In the 1990s, when DNA technology became viable for criminal investigation, investigators retrieved those stored samples and ran them through the newly established CODIS system, the FBI's National Criminal DNA Database. The profile from the rape kit was complete, clean, and clear. It was the best kind of evidence, a full genetic signature of the killer, preserved perfectly across 10+ years in a storage room. The search came back with 0 matches, not because the science failed, because the man who had left that DNA had never been entered into the system. By 1993, 11 years into the investigation, Detective Don Means stood in the Sheep's Flat meadow for a television camera and summed up the situation with a kind of quiet precision that only comes from years of working inside a problem with no visible exit. He said if they knew who she was, they would know who killed her. That was the trap the case lived inside. The victim's identity and the killer's identity were locked together, each one the key to the other, and neither door would open from the outside. The years moved. Investigators who had worked the case retired. New ones arrived, read the file, hit the same walls, and kept going anyway because walls are not the same as endings. The case never closed. It never became a national story. It appeared in local newspapers when a reporter pulled old files, then slipped back into silence. It was too old to be urgent, too stubborn to be forgotten. Larry Canfield was one of the original investigators. He retired but did not retire from this case. He continued following it, watching every development in forensic technology, reading about every new method, waiting with a patience that only comes from believing something is true. He said, "Once we have the suspect's DNA, sooner or later it will break." He was right. He just didn't know it would take 37 years. In 2010, 28 years after the body was found in the meadow, a forensic odontologist conducted a new examination of the dental evidence and reached a conclusion that demolished the foundation the investigation had been built on. The dental work was not European. It was American. The gold bridge, the porcelain facing, the technique, all of it was consistent with American dental practice, not European. 3 decades of investigation aimed at the wrong continent. A reasonable theory built on reasonable observations that happened to be wrong. When that theory fell, the structure around it fell too. Detective Dave Jenkins, working inside Washoe County's newly formed cold case unit, rebuilt from nothing. The new picture of the victim placed her on the west coast of the United States. It also suggested something about why no one had reported her missing. She had likely, gradually, voluntarily cut contact with her family and friends years before she died. Not vanished suddenly, not been taken, simply faded, by degrees, out of the lives of people who had once known her. By the time she was murdered, there was no one left who expected her to call. That was why the phone stayed silent. In 2015, the Washoe County Sheriff's Office posted the case on social media, featuring it as their cold case of the month. A volunteer forensic artist named Carl Kopelman, an accountant by profession who had created facial reconstructions for more than 250 unidentified victims since 2009, produced a new composite of her face. For the first time in 3 decades, people could look at something closer to her. The case appeared on NAMUS and the DOE network, public databases for unidentified remains. True crime communities picked it up. Bloggers wrote about her. Podcasters told her story. None of them solved it, but they kept her visible, kept someone somewhere searching, kept the case from disappearing entirely. In the grave at our Mother of Sorrows cemetery, the green plastic flag held its position in the dirt. Mary Edith Silvani was born on September 29, 1948, in Pontiac, Michigan. She grew up in Detroit, the only daughter in a family that was coming apart before she was old enough to understand what that meant. Her father, John, was an Italian immigrant born in France. Her mother, Blanche, whose maiden name was Curry, struggled with mental illness for years before leaving the family entirely. She never came back. She died in 1980 without seeing her children again. Mary had 2 older brothers, Robert and Charles, but by the time she was a teenager, the family unit that might have held her together was already scattered. Her father died in 1964. Mary was 16. No mother, no father, no real home. A former classmate named Paula Headley remembered her from those years. Quiet. Kind. She loved art. She visited the Detroit Institute of Arts when she could. She never talked about her family. There is a photo of her in the 1966 yearbook at Mackenzie High School in Detroit, a girl in the frame who would have no idea what the meadow was waiting for. There is no graduation record attached to her name. After their father died, the siblings briefly tried to maintain the family house so Mary could finish school. Then, one by one, they moved west to California. Each of them carried their own life and the weight of a childhood that had given them very little to carry forward. By around 1972, Mary had disappeared from the lives of everyone who had known her in Michigan. The last time anyone saw her, she was pregnant and living in a boarding house for single women. There was a phone call. She said the child had been given up for adoption. That was the last time anyone heard her voice. The 11-centimeter scar the medical examiner measured 10 years later was the only remaining physical record of that moment. A child existed somewhere, born and released, and Mary moved on carrying a scar and whatever else that year had placed inside her. In 1974, she was arrested for vagrancy in Detroit, a minor offense. The kind people forget before they have even left the station. She paid whatever she owed, or didn't, and moved on. Her fingerprints were recorded and filed. Nobody thought about them again. Between 1974 and 1982, no one who knew her during those years has ever been found. 8 years of life with no witnesses. She moved from Michigan to California, but the route, the timing, the stops along the way, all of it is gone. The people she left behind in Michigan told investigators the same thing from different angles. Mary wanted a fresh start. She was out there somewhere. They figured she was doing okay. No one was worried because Mary had made her absence feel like a choice, not a crisis, and maybe it had been both. She had lived so carefully at the edges of visibility that when she finally stopped moving through the world did not notice the gap she left. That is the real weight of her story. Not just the way it ended in that high meadow, but the long, quiet disappearance that preceded it. A woman who had lost her mother, then her father, then her siblings to distance, then the child she carried, then her own name, before anyone ever pulled a trigger. In February of 2018, a small group of forensic investigators from the Washoe County Sheriff's Office flew to Seattle for the annual conference of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. It was the kind of event where professionals gather to share the newest methods in a field that is always changing. That year, one presentation in particular was about a method most of the people in the room had never heard of. The speaker was Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick. Fitzpatrick had a career that reads like two separate lives joined at the middle. She had trained in physics. She had worked for NASA and the Department of Defense. Then she left that world entirely and founded an organization called Identifinders International, dedicated to using Y-chromosomal DNA testing to trace the identities of unknown male perpetrators in cold cases. Men who had walked away from crime scenes decades ago, believing they had left nothing useful behind. Sharing the stage with her was Margaret Press. Press had published novels. She had written code in the finance industry. She had worked in linguistics. She had stumbled into genetic genealogy as a hobby in 2007, connecting adopted children with their biological families through DNA databases. The pivot into forensics happened one afternoon while she was reading a mystery novel. She realized, almost as a joke that turned serious, that the skills she used to find living birth parents for adoptees could be reversed. Instead of connecting the living to their origins, she could connect the dead to their names. In both cases, she said, "You are looking for parents?" In 2017, Fitzpatrick and Press had co-founded the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit with a single stated mission: give names back to the unidentified dead of America. Nobody in the organization drew a salary. More than 60 volunteer genealogists worked without pay. Press was direct when asked about the finances. They were not making money. They were spending their own savings. The Washoe County team sat in that Seattle auditorium and gradually understood that they were looking at the tool they had been waiting for without knowing it existed. Within weeks of returning, they made contact with both organizations, and the official work began in April of 2018. A few weeks after that, on April 24, 2018, the state of California announced the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, using forensic genealogy. The technique went global overnight, covered on every major news outlet, debated in legislatures, celebrated by families who had waited decades for answers. It must be said clearly that the Silvani case was not inspired by the DeAngelo arrest. The work had already started, but that announcement confirmed for everyone watching that the method was real and that the Washoe County team was not chasing a theory. They were chasing a result. The evidence from the case was sent to a private laboratory. Technicians worked with samples that had been in storage for 36 years, extracting usable DNA profiles from materials collected on the day the body was found. The rape kit, properly preserved through 4 decades of storage and 2 changes of century, still held a complete genetic profile of the killer. And now, for the first time in the history of the case, there was a method that could read it without requiring him to already be in a government database. Two parallel tracks of investigation ran simultaneously. The first used DNA extracted from the victim's remains to identify who she was. The second used DNA from the rape kit to identify who had killed her. Both profiles were uploaded to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where millions of people around the world voluntarily upload their own DNA to search for relatives. No criminal conviction required. No prior arrest. Just families looking for each other. Margaret Press described how the process works with a simple image. Imagine a giant swap meet where every table belongs to a different family. You walk in carrying a piece of silverware and you move from table to table asking if anyone recognizes the pattern. Does this spoon match anything in your set? And somewhere in that enormous room, someone says yes. The victim's DNA profile returned initial results faster than anyone had predicted. The data suggested that one of her grandparents was Italian or of Italian descent. Her mitochondrial DNA placed her in a specific genetic haplogroup. Two distant cousins appeared in the database, people who had no idea they were about to become the first links in a chain that would return a name to a woman who had lain without one for 36 years. Those cousins connected to other relatives in New York. The genealogists worked backward up the family tree, branch by branch, eliminating possibilities, tracing lines, narrowing the geography and the generation. The tree pointed to a couple in Detroit, Michigan, John and Blanche Silvani. The couple had only one daughter. 3 days from the first matches to a name. 3 days to answer a question that had outlasted multiple careers and spanned 4 decades. But a name found through genealogy and a name confirmed by evidence are different things, and investigators needed confirmation. They contacted the Detroit Police Department and searched old records for the minor arrest from 1974. They found what they were looking for. A woman arrested for vagrancy, fingerprints recorded and filed and forgotten for 44 years. They compared those fingerprints to the fingerprints taken from the body in the Sheep's Flat Meadow in 1982. A perfect match. In July of 2018, the DNA Doe Project announced publicly that they believed they had identified her. 2 months later, the confirmation was official. In August 2018, Washoe County Chief Medical Examiner Laura Knight signed the death certificate. For the first time in 36 years, the woman in the meadow officially existed in government records with her own name, but the announcement was held back. The killer had not yet been identified, and releasing her name prematurely risked alerting people who might destroy evidence or disappear. Robert Silvani Jr. had never met his aunt. His father, Robert Sr., was her brother. Robert Sr. had stayed in Detroit long enough to start a family, then come apart, cut off his wife and young son, and drifted west to California and eventually to Oregon, where he died alone. Robert Jr. was 4 years old when his father left. He grew up without family, without context, without the kind of story most people inherit from the people who raised them. About a year before the press conference, his phone lit up with a Facebook message from someone he had never heard of. The DNA Doe Project had traced the family tree and found him. The message said that a murder victim had been connected to his family and asked if he would be willing to submit a DNA sample. He said yes. His sample confirmed what the genealogist suspected. He was told to keep the information confidential because the investigation was still ongoing. He waited for months, carrying the secret of a relative he had never met, who had been killed before he was born, whose name he had never heard spoken in his own home because there had been no one left to speak it. The DNA process also connected him to a woman named Angel Capriles in New York City, a distant cousin he had no idea existed. Capriles' mother and Mary had grown up in the same world. When Capriles learned who the unidentified victim was, her reaction was the kind of grief that comes from learning something was lost long before you knew it could have been found. "There are so many questions we don't know," she said, like why she never came back. Everyone thought she had a good life. The second track of investigation was moving at the same time through the same database with a different sample. The killer's DNA, clean and complete in the rape kit, was uploaded to GEDmatch. The results pointed to a family in Dallas, Texas. The genealogists built the tree from there. The Dallas family had 3 sons and 1 known grandson. The known grandson was quickly ruled out. The suspect was not a recognized branch. He was a secret. One of the 3 Dallas sons had fathered a child outside of marriage. That child had been raised by his mother under her surname, deliberately separated from the paternal line, invisible in every family record that investigation might normally reach. Genealogist Cheryl Hester spent months tracing a branch that had been carefully hidden, narrowing the search to a neighborhood where two women were each raising a child born out of wedlock, each child carrying their mother's surname. Hester did not stop. She found the answer. His name was James Richard Curry, born November 16, 1946, in Bexar County, Texas. An illegitimate child whose father's family had not wanted to acknowledge him. His mother raised him under her own name. He had a criminal record. Robbery in Texas. He served time at Huntsville Prison and was released in 1977. After that, he moved to Waukegan, a small community in Tulare County, California, where he worked at a locksmith shop called J&M Locksmith. The Washoe County investigators built a picture of what James Richard Curry had done in the years surrounding July of 1982, and the picture was one of a man operating in escalating cycles of violence. But beneath all of those specific failures was a structural one, and it is the hardest to fix. The entire system for finding missing people depends on someone reporting them missing. Mary Silvani had made her absence feel like a choice before it became a murder. The people who had known her assumed she had moved on. That assumption was reasonable given the life she had lived and the way she had gradually stepped back from everyone who might have looked for her. Nobody filed a report. No report meant no file. No file meant no starting point for comparison. The investigation circled endlessly around a question it could not answer because the answer was locked behind a door the system had no key for. The DNA Doe project was built to address exactly this structural gap. It uses GED match rather than CODIS, which means it doesn't require the victim or the perpetrator to have any prior contact with the criminal justice system. It only requires their relatives anywhere in the world to have uploaded their own DNA profiles to a genealogy database for entirely personal reasons. Those relatives become, without knowing it, the map that leads investigators home. The Silvani case was not only solved by this method, it was the first case in American forensic history where forensic genealogy was used simultaneously to identify both an unidentified victim and an unknown perpetrator. Both doors opened at once. Both names came out together. No one had done that before. There are practical things that come out of this story for anyone watching. If you have the means to upload your DNA to a public genealogy database, whether GED Match, 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, or another platform, there is value in doing so beyond finding relatives. Every profile added to those databases makes the next unidentified victim easier to trace and the next unknown perpetrator easier to name. The genealogists working these cases are not searching for your profile directly. They are building trees from distant connections, and the more people contribute, the more trees can be completed. If someone in your life has been out of contact for a long time, a sibling, an old friend, someone who slowly disappeared without drama or explanation, do not assume the absence is only a choice. The system does not search for people no one reports. If something feels wrong, make the call. File the report. Let investigators decide whether there is a problem. Your silence cannot help anyone. If you work in law enforcement or forensics, preserve your evidence, all of it, even the cases that feel completely unsolvable. The rape kit that identified James Richard Curry as Mary Silvani's killer had been sitting in a storage room since 1982. If someone had discarded it as useless, the case would have closed without a name on either side. Science does not stop moving. Evidence should wait for it. Mary Edith Silvani lived a life that had taken everything from her, one at a time across years. Her mother left. Her father died. Her siblings scattered. A child was born and released. Her name faded from one community, then another, until she was living entirely beyond the reach of anyone who might have noticed she was gone. She walked into a meadow in the Nevada mountains one July morning, intending to go to the lake, and she never walked out. For 37 years, the only marker on her grave was a small green plastic flag stuck in the soil. It took two women who were not police officers, 60 unpaid volunteers, a database built by people searching for their own families, and the preserved evidence from a rape kit sealed in 1982 to finally write her name on a stone. She has been found. She will not be lost again.